Hey, I'm so excited to be with you here today because we're going to be talking about male's definition of abuse. Too often we focus exclusively on the woman's experience of abuse, but we act as if men don't get abused when they do. So today we're going to really be focusing on the male experience and why men have a habit of not spotting abuse when they're being abused. I was thinking of a recent interview that I had with ex-patriarch, which he was being abused, and the police got called, and fortunately, their stories aligned that he was the one who was being hurt. And the police said, "Listen, if you don't protect yourself, she could have changed the story and you would have been the one that was in trouble." So it's risky when men fail to see that they're in an abusive situation. It's very risky. But I think there's another problem. And it kind of showed up if you guys paid attention to yesterday's podcast episode, which a lot of you were quite triggered or upset about it on breaking free from narcissistic abuse. And that is sometimes men define abuse in a way that women don't understand. It's not the way we see things, and our experience is wildly different. So, as a result, it's like we're talking about two different things, which can lead to different perspectives or understanding. So let's first of all talk about how often are men abused by women. And you're probably not surprised to hear this, that kind of figures are actually really hard to get. There's not a lot of good statistics, and the best country reporting them is the UK. So in the UK, out of around 2.4 million reports, that's the national statistics reported that approximately 13% of men had experienced some form of partner abuse in their life compared to roughly a quarter of the women. And in the last 12 months, and I don't know what 12 months snapshot they're using, 2 or 3.2% of men said that they had been a victim of domestic abuse, whereas 5.7 women in the UK said that they had been. And another source said that approximately 1 in 6 to 7 men experienced domestic abuse in their lifetime. Whereas in the United States, the CDC data shows that 1 in 10 men has experienced some form of intimate violence or physical violence or stalking by an intimate partner. Um, which is interesting because then the next question I had was, well, how many men experience intimate violence with a male partner? So if you're looking at homosexual relationships, what's the rate of that? Well, in the gay population, approximately 46% of men report some form of intimate partner violence in that past year. And again, I don't know what year they're talking of, how many years ago that was, but I find that astonishing. So it does show that there's kind of interesting experiences that differ between same sex relationships and opposite sex relationships. So let's go start out today. I want to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about. I'm so thrilled that you're joining me. I'm Dr. Carrie McAvoy, a retired psychologist and also an abuse survivor. And I'm happy that you're here because we're going to really dive into what do men mean when they say they've been abused. So I want to first talk about the gender differences and definitions and what the language that we use to define it. And then I also want to talk about what men call abuse, even if it doesn't fit the psychological definition or the. And then we're going to go into how does this perspective, this definition that may or may not align with abuse, harm men, and how does it harm their family and their partners? And then we're going to talk about why men struggle to report abuse. And then if you stick around long enough, and I would love to have you be here, we're going to also ask, we're going to look closer at how do you know that it's abuse versus just a normal conflict? Because often it may be just that this is what happens in relationship because we disagree, because we're not the same people. It's sort of the growing pains of intimacy. So how do you know when it's abuse versus something that's normal to relationships? And then if you're a man, if you're a guy and you're experiencing some form of this, we're going to get into what should you do if you believe that you are being abused. So I'm really thrilled that you're here to me today because I know that one of the things that frustrates me is that all this rhetoric on the right and left about what's good relationship and who owes whom what and how do you balance power and equity. I know lately there's been some push in some states to lower the age of marriage, which usually we're not talking about women marrying younger men. We're looking at men wanting to marry younger women, actually young men wanting to marry younger girls. So how do you know when this is abuse And what is abuse? So we're going to dive into this really thorny subject today. I'm so thrilled that you're here with me. And so if you're new, maybe you know someone you want to share this with. Maybe there's somebody you've been in a debate with about what is abuse and what constitutes abuse and are they being abused, and or maybe you're just like just for sake of arguments, you're having a philosophical discussion or cultural discussion. This may be a live you want to share with them, but I also would love to have you be sure to like and follow just so that you can stay up to date, because we have these types of big discussions every Tuesday at 4 p.m. So I'd love to have you come back and join me for another live. So let's talk about the gender differences in the definition of abuse. So, unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, cultural conditioning is a really big piece of how we socialize what we see as normal and typical in relationships. And as a result, are we surprised that men and women are socialized to interpret relationship conflicts extremely differently? In fact, I really enjoyed the Netflix series, the limited series called Adolescence, because it showed it up close how that young boy had been socialized to see himself as him being rejected as then that person, the woman that rejected him, is deserving of harm, that she had harmed him in her rejection, so him harming her was sort of kind of fair. So it's really interesting how cultural conditioning really shapes our definition. Men often will downplay or dismiss coercive control, verbal aggression, or emotional manipulation because they've been taught to laugh it off and they don't want to appear weak. Whereas women have often been socialized to notice emotional nuances, whereas they may minimize physical intimidation as long as it doesn't go to something more overt. Also, we're not surprised, I'm sure, that patriarchy and stereotypes play a massive role. Abuse often is framed through the perspective of a male perpetrator with a female victim lens, which creates this cultural blind spot that there can be female on male abuse that which often gets sort of minimized or laughed off. I was talking to my massage therapist a while back, who was a man, and he was sharing about how he actually was assaulted. His girlfriend assaulted him and I think gave him a bloody nose or something. And his father laughed it off at him and told him what a kind of what a wimp he was for having that happen. And I was shocked because to me it was like if the tables had been turned, this would have been something extremely serious. But because he was a guy, it was seen as something silly or minor or him not being manly enough. The other problem is there's different thresholds for what counts as abuse. Studies have shown that men are less likely to label non-physical behaviors like jealousy or isolation, verbal insults, even coercion as abuse. They're less likely to see that as abuse, whereas women are more likely to identify emotional abuse, but they may not recognize financial control or reproductive coercion. And then there's the problem with stigma and shame, because men are taught from a very early age not to want to be seen as weak or not to want to be in any way emasculated by admitting to victimization, which then causes them to sort of redefine and minimize their partner's actions. Whereas women more likely are to fear being blamed or disbelieved, which distorts their willingness to actually name behaviors as abuse. And that you can see that how that happens in the reporting of SA. Women are more reluctant to do that because we don't really want to come under the scrutiny of having someone question us, whereas men probably are more likely to not want to do that because that would. In fact, I remember my ex, and I don't never know how much I believe anything he says because a lot of what he said was a lie. But he was experienced SA early as a youngster, and he was told how lucky he was that he experienced it, that he got training on how to. And I'm thinking, no, that was horribly abusive and very harmful, but it had been reinterpreted as something he should be proud of and almost like a badge of some kind. So it's important that we see that these types of biases, like women don't want to be called out as that we're liars, and men, however, don't want to be seen as they should enjoy it because it's something they should have enjoyed when there was nothing about it that was safe or equitable or definitely enjoyable about the experience. And then there's the problem with the professional and legal system that reinforces this divide. Unfortunately, courts and law enforcement and even therapists sometimes hold biased assumptions that men can't be victims and that women's abuse isn't as serious because it didn't leave any bruises on them. So that then causes this feedback loop that then causes survivors to internalize the same bias. So there are gender differences that really interfere with the ability for people to report abuse as well as to protect themselves better. So let's revisit what abuse really actually is. And again, if you watched yesterday's podcast, you can see how it was termed as a squishy term. No, I don't think abuse is a squishy term. I think there's a very clear definition. The clear definition is an equity of power when one person is exploiting another in order to take advantage of that individual, in order to dominate that individual. And this leaves lasting psychological and physical scars on individuals. So it may be experienced as emotional abuse, which is insults, gaslighting, humiliation, isolation, threats, manipulation, erosion of self-worth, creates confusion. It could be spiritual abuse, which is misusing religious or moral beliefs in order to shame, silence, or control a person's choices. Physical abuse is any kind of physicality that restrains or harms person and instills fear. SA is pressuring, coercion, or forcing activity without full and enthusiastic consent. And then coercive control, which underpins all of it, that's happening underneath all of it, is an ongoing pattern of monitoring, intimidating, and restraining or restricting a person's freedoms and keeps them trapped in fear and dependence. Abuse is not a squishy term. Let me say that again. It is a person exploiting the power in order to dominate another. So, how do men typically define abuse, even if it doesn't fit the psychological definition? Well, primarily, unfortunately, they define it by physicality. So they kind of equate it as visible violence. So hitting, punching, slapping, being physically restrained. But if their partner doesn't leave marks or bruises or draw blood, then they conclude that it wasn't abuse. And you can hear from the story that I have from my massage therapist where there actually was, physical signs of abuse, and he still wasn't seen as abuse. And even when I said it was abuse in that moment, I reacted, and he's like, no, I mean, I laughed it off. And I'm thinking, why are you laughing it off? That wasn't a funny moment at all. So that's the first reason why men often misdefine or struggle recognizing abuse. The second is there's a dismissal of emotional harm. They often will see verbal put downs, constant criticisms, yelling, or silent treatment as just fighting. What happens between couples? It's just signs of a difficult relationship. They may see gaslighting or manipulation as just drama or nagging. They're being nagged at and not see that that's actually a form of emotional harm. And then SA gets, physical intimacy gets overlooked because they may not recognize the pressure or the coercion. They may just say, oh, well, that's how relationships work. And in fact, they may feel ashamed that they didn't want to go along, but they went along with it because they're supposed to. They're expected to show up that way. Often for them, coercive control feels invisible. They don't see that the surveillance they're experiencing, the jealousy they're combating, the restrictions on their friendships, or the financial control they may be experiencing. They may register that as possessiveness or bad communication instead of seeing that as coercive control. And because coercive control is more psychological and systemic, they often can't name it until a whole lot later. So unfortunately, as you can see, stigma, social scripts, and legal and institutional biases don't validate male victimization experiences. And it kind of reinforces sort of, unfortunately, this more masculine perspective that men are above it or it just doesn't happen to men, which keeps men in a very narrow definition of what abuse is and leaves them vulnerable to prolonged harm because they're blind to the bigger picture. So how does this harm men to have this masculine definition of abuse? Well, one, it keeps them from recognizing what's happening, which delays them from seeking help. Because they can't recognize emotional manipulation and coercive control or any form of coercive control, even SA, they often stay in damaging relationships for far too long. And by the time they acknowledge it, the harm has been compounded, which has eroded their mental health, their finances, and sense of self. I think that was interesting in the podcast episode yesterday with Josh from the Derelict podcast, where he didn't wake up to it. His wife actually left him, and that was the first signal that they had a problem. He thought, in fact, he even said, happy wife, happy life. And that's a common perspective, is if they can keep peace in the house, even if it's not a good peace, an easy peace, then it just means everything's okay. but they don't recognize that maybe it's really not okay. There's something going really wrong. The other problem is there's a deep sense of shame and isolation. Men often tell themselves, it's not abuse unless I've been struck. So they invalidate their own suffering, which reinforces the shame that real men don't get abused and keeps men silent. And unfortunately, their peers also isolate them from that and keep them from seeking professional help. Number three is there's a higher risk of escalation because they are minimizing the emotional and psychological harm. Then they don't see the risk of escalation of their partner's difficulties. The partner may be becoming out of control with the jealousy and the surveillance, and it may be just brushed off and seen as not signaling greater danger. Because here's another reality about abuse is that, and this is something I didn't get until I was way out of the relationship, is that it escalates. It gets worse over time. And you may say, well, they don't, like in my case, I never got called a name. Now, he was throwing things against the wall and breaking phones and, certainly rushing me at times, and he even told me I was lucky that I wasn't one of his earlier wives, but I didn't see that there was gonna be growing danger to me. It's staying that over time, those boundaries that were seemed to be there that protected me were gonna be eroded away, and I was gonna be at risk. Men do the same thing. They don't see that this increased tension that they're feeling, the surveillance, the jealousy, all of that they may be happening in that relationship, that this is something that's escalating into something that could become much, much worse. And then there's systemic disadvantages because the courts, the police, and even therapists have the same blind spots that if men can't name it, they don't report it, then the institutions are even less likely to take them seriously, which leaves them unprotected legally and socially. And then there's this internalized, distorted belief in which this only happens to women, so that some men unconsciously excuse or minimize women's harmful behavior, which makes them more vulnerable to repeated patterns of toxic relationships. I can't tell you, and it irks me. And this is one of the reasons my platform is always open to both men and women, because I witnessed both men and women being abused in my life. I've seen it around that there's this narrative out there that men don't get abused, only women do, and it's patriarchy, and that men always benefit from the patriarchy. That's not true. Men do get abused, at maybe not in the same rates that women do, but this is a thing that's harmful to both men and women. The exploitation happens on both parts, and that if we can't see it, we can't help people get out of it. Now, here's the problem I think that causes this confusion. When the allegation of abuse happens, both partners feel wrong. If you've ever listened to it, how many times have you heard when you've tried to report your story is, well, I want to hear the other side. I want to hear what the other person has to say. Both partners often feel betrayed, feel like something wrong happened, didn't get their way. And sometimes there's a measure of truth to both angles. But here's the part of that that's the bigger problem is that you can't sometimes tell when who's reacting and who is the perpetrator. So I'm trying to think of if I'm explaining this really well, because I'm sure for some of you, you're like, but you don't understand. Like my ex thinks that I took advantage of him. He didn't walk out of this relationship with what he wanted. Now, I consider what he wanted wasn't fair. It was wrong. It was, he was taking advantage of me. I know that he felt that he got harmed in that because he didn't get what he wanted. But I also know if you got him to admit he was being deceptive, he was exploiting me, he was actually embezzling, likely, certainly serial cheating, which none of those things I was doing. So I was definitely the one being taken advantage of. And so, but he has his story. And so sometimes it gets really tricky because both parties have the story for us to figure out where the truth is. And I think as a result of that, we then dismiss it saying, oh, it's just two people who can't get along, instead of realizing that maybe it did start with somebody. Somebody is controlling, somebody has more power. Here's how to tell. Here's a good way how to tell who has the most power. The person with the most power in the relationship is the one who's least afraid of losing the relationship. They're usually the one who's taken the greatest risks, harming the relationship, because to them, if they get caught, they're very good at convincing the other person to stick it out and try again. The person who has the least power is the most invested. They usually have the most skin in the game. They usually are the one that loves the person more deeply, more committed. And as a result of that, they're the one who's vulnerable to the other person, and they're more likely to be afraid and being exploited. So watch for the power. See, it always comes back to power inequity. Watch the power inequity. That's going to tell you where, like, who's controlling the relationship, who's running the scripts for this relationship. That's going to give you a better sense of how to kind of suss this out. Now, is it really our job to figure out the truth? No, not necessarily, but it is when we take the stand that there is no power inequity, that everything's always fair, and there's just two sides of the story. We're going to be blind, and we're going to force this person into silence, and we're not going to give them the harm or the help that they really deserve. Okay, so how does this masculine definition of abuse harm women and children? Well, it normalizes harmful dynamics at home. Because the man isn't naming his partner's behavior as abusive, children grow up in an environment seeing yelling, control, humiliation, and manipulation as just normal conflict. And it sets them up to either repeat the cycle as perpetrators or to tolerate the cycle as victims. Women's experiences end up getting minimized. So when men insist that abuse only counts when it's physical, it reinforced the narrative that any woman's suffering doesn't matter, that emotional and the sexual and financial abuse women get dismissed as a relationship problem, making it harder for women to get support and to be believed. And then children don't get protection. If the father only sees physical assault as real abuse, he may overlook the psychological harm his children are absorbing from their mother. And as a result, they may be exposed to constant tension, criticism, and control because he's not intervening because no one's getting hit. And it perpetuates the gender blind spot, which is that women can't be perpetrators, which underestimates the harm women are capable of and skews the legal system and child protective services, making them less responsive when the woman is the abusive parent. So it keeps the cycle of silence alive, because children who grow up in homes where abuse isn't named don't learn how to identify it. And they end up also in the future minimizing partners' abusiveness and internalizing the idea that they just aren't doing a good enough of enduring, that it's not bad enough to count. So, what kind of abuse could men be experiencing, but they're failing to recognize it as abuse or harmful? Well, emotional and psychological, like criticism, being belittled, shaming, things being framed as jokes. Now, the thing is, women who are abusive tend to be more verbal. Their forms of abuse tends to be more emotional manipulation than it does tend to be physical intimidation. So, there's a big difference in how it shows up. There may be gaslighting, told that they're imagining things, they're overreacting or crazy. I don't know how many of you saw the video. It was probably a year or so ago about this guy who was looking at this tool or something. I don't remember what it was. It was something in his backyard, and he was thinking about this thing in terms of perspective, like all the ways that it had served him and the kind of time that it had witnessed in his life and how it had changed. And his wife belittled him and made him, I mean, I was so uncomfortable with that. First of all, I couldn't believe the video got posted. And then he laughed it off later and said, "Oh, it wasn't bad. She didn't hurt me." But I was crushed. I was crushed for him. That's a real, yes, a spool of wire. Thank you. Yeah, he was looking at a spool of wire, reflecting on what that had seen and what part of it's like my dad. My dad was one of these people who collected things in his garage, and he would have been one of them that had a spool of wire, and he might say that came back from your great grandfather's farm way back when they were still, you know what I'm saying, telling the story. And yet that wife, like, what are you doing? And how stupid is that? And why would I can't believe, don't you have better things to do? I was so crushed for him because it was so hurtful in that experience. So that may not be seen as abuse, but it is clearly a form of abuse. There's also silent treatment, withholding affection, and sulking to punish. Or even there's another form of abuse that women don't often see themselves doing, and that they play helpless. I don't know. I mean, you do it, or you can do it. We get on men for weaponizing competence. Well, women are just as good as weaponized incompetence at men. We play it as a victim role, we're the helpless damsel that we need someone to help us step over the puddle. Or they frame their jealousy as how much they love this guy and how much they care for him. They just care for him too much. And then there's the abuse as coercive control that men experience, like monitoring their calls, their texts, wanting to know where their whereabouts are, all in the guise of concern when really it's more of a guise of control, dictating who they can see or what they can wear or how much money they get to spend. And end up men may feel a fear of upsetting their partner and start to walk on eggshells as well. And they may start to gradually be isolated from their friends and families as a result of it. And then there's SA, where they end up being pressured or guilted into intimacy that they don't want, or they are used shame that real men always should want this. They may ignore the man's lack of consent or boundaries or readiness, and or even use intimacy as a bargaining chip or as a way to withhold it and punish. And then there's financial abuse, where his earnings could be controlled or demanded access to accounts. There could be running up of debts in his name and sabotaging financial stability. I don't know how many stories I've heard of men finding out. Somebody just recently told me that their partners were going on lots of shopping trips and they weren't aware of it. And they didn't know how much debt they'd been accrued as a result of that. So here they thought they were doing better, in a better financial position, maybe closer to retiring. And now they find out that they're not, and they're in very deep trouble. They may be like criticizing how money gets spent or even how they get earned. Or I haven't, I think there was one time I was in the office, it was a couple, and this woman actually started comparing her partner to past partners in front of me. And I was horrified. I couldn't, and he wasn't doing it to her, but she was doing it to him. He was actually being like emasculated in front of me around, I mean, and I end up wondering, how does he walk out with her? How's he going to ever be safe to take any kind of risk with her and be vulnerable with her again? Then there's spiritual abuse, where there's faith and morals and cultural values are used to shame him into compliance, or telling him that if he divorces or leaves, that he's a bad man or he's a failure. So, and how often do we end up saying, because a woman is slighter, smaller, maybe not as strong, that if she pushes it or throws objects or blocks exits, that's not real abuse? Or men will dismiss this as not serious because they don't really actually fear physical harm from a woman, because they know that they have the upper hand in the physical strength department. So as a result, men often will recognize the conflict, but they won't recognize the abuse. And they may interpret harmful patterns as just relationship issues, which delays them getting help and reinforces the stigma that men can't be victims. So I would like to know, let's talk about how you could know if this really is abuse or if it's just part of a relational conflict. Like maybe there's some times where you guys are just in a disagreement that it's normal. That's just part of people working things through, but maybe it's an abuse. So I want to get into that. There are 5 different things that you can look at that will help you know that if you're in an abusive situation, or if this is just sort of what happens in relationships when couples are working issues out. One has to do with power control versus mutuality and respect. So it's abuse when one partner consistently dominates, makes decisions, and punishes the other for not complying. Whereas a normal challenge, where both people have influence, even if they disagree or argue, there's compromises, and they often can even find a way to agree to disagree. So if there's an equity of power and an equity of mutual respect, that's more of a normal conflict between partners. Whereas if there's one dominating and one always coming out on top, that's actually a power imbalance that indicates abuse. Second, look at fear versus safety. If you are afraid, and this is actually good for both genders, if you're afraid of your partner's reactions, if you find yourself walking on eggshells, censoring yourself, or avoiding certain topics, that's a sign of intimidation and a sign of abuse. Whereas in a normal relationship where power and balances don't exist, you may not like to argue, but you're not afraid for your safety and you don't feel trapped. Number 3, look at the erosion of self versus growth through conflict. So in an abusive situation, you find yourself feeling smaller, more confused, less confident, and constantly feeling like you're wrong. Where in a normal challenge in a relationship, you may get defensive and upset, but eventually there's clarification and you actually strengthen the relationship as you work out these differences. Look at number 4, punishment versus boundary setting. Abuse is when your partner withholds affection, money, communication, or threatens consequences as a way to control you. Whereas in a normal situation, they may set a boundary like, I'm not okay with being yelled at, but it's more about protecting themselves than it is trying to control you. And then finally, look at patterns versus an occasional conflict. In an abusive situation, harmful behaviors are often repeated in a predictable cycle, and there's a power imbalance with ongoing harm. Whereas normal challenges in a relationship, arguments are situational and vary in intensity, but repair and recovery is possible, and both partners contribute to that. Please notice that both partners contribute to that. So, how do you know if you're facing real abuse or if this is just a normal conflictual situation? Here's some questions you can ask yourself. So, ask if you notice how many times you say yes to this, okay? Because that's going to be a way for you to have a good gauge on this. Do I feel afraid of my partner's reactions if I speak honestly? That will help you know if you're saying yes, then there's an inequity of power. Number 2, does my partner punish me with silence, threats, withholding, or intimidation when I don't comply? Now, this can get really subtle. This could be like, you know that um, you just disagreeing with it is going to cause that. Here's one that would happen to me. I would know that it was an important night. We had maybe a big agenda that I was really invested in. We're going to go out. And I there's something happened and I didn't want it to be, if I let it go, then I would be accused that I didn't deal with it in the moment. I was sort of like on this timeline. Like if I didn't deal with it right away, then it must not have been that bad. And then I can't bring it up. It's as if there's a timeline to bringing up conflict. But if I bring it up and it results in some kind of a conflict, then he's going to shut down and ruin the evening. He's going to either not speak or not show up or refuse to go. So I would end up being in this terrible pattern of I was paralyzed because I knew if I let it go and didn't deal with it, I was going to be vulnerable to happening again. But if I did bring it up, he was going to use it to sabotage the evening because he knew I was invested in the evening and it mattered a whole lot to me and he was going to harm me for it. So that can happen on both partners. So watch if you're being punished for just simply having an opinion or showing up. Number 3, do you end up feeling over time smaller, less confident, or more confused in this relationship? Number 4, do you feel like your partner holds the power and that your needs and your voice don't matter? Here's another thing I see really common with men. They don't recognize how much they're people pleasing. They wouldn't even define it as people pleasing. To them, it's sort of like a foreign concept. But if you find yourself um, feeling like you're trying to anticipate what your partner needs without them asking so that you can keep them happy, that may end up being that you are now trying to mind read this individual and that you're giving their needs, their wants, everything more power than you are giving yourself, that you're kind of holding yourself in abeyance while you are trying to then help this other situation to sort of like be the bigger person, be the bigger man. And I've seen this really common, and it creates over time, when you do this a lot, it creates resentment. You feel underappreciated, like no one sees the sacrifices. They may not even know that you're making sacrifices, but you know the sacrifices that you're making, but you feel like no one's recognizing the sacrifices that you're making. And over time, you start to feel really resentful, like you're doing more work than they're doing, and they're taking advantage of you. You'll start to feel like they're taking advantage of you. So there's a way that this kind of can show up for you. It happens on both sides, but I see a lot of men do this, and they would have no idea that this is kind of, you might want to call it codependency. You might want to call it people pleasing. They may, because that's a soft word, and they wouldn't like themselves seeing that they're soft like that, but it does show up that way. Number 5, is there a repeated pattern of harm, not just occasional disagreements? So if you're answering yes to one or more of these questions, you may be experiencing abuse, not just conflict. And, I really want everyone to hear this. Everyone deserves safety, respect, and mutual care in their closest relationships. You should feel safe to show up as yourself. So if you've been listening to this today and thought, wow, I had no idea I may be in a toxic relationship, maybe it's even an abusive relationship, but me as a man, I would never have termed or qualified it that way. Here's some things that I'd like you to consider doing if you suspect that may be true. First, I want you to acknowledge the signs. Trust your instincts. If you're feeling controlled, demeaned, afraid, and trapped, those are red flags. Remember, abuse isn't just a physical thing, it's also emotional, spiritual, financial, and there's coercive control, and they're all very serious. I also want you to break the silence. I know this is really hard, and I know that maybe you don't have a support system that will really allow you to do that very well, but consider who you can trust in your life. Maybe it's a friend or a family member, or a counselor, or maybe it's look for maybe it's a support line, but look for a place that you can reach out and talk to someone and get some validation. Talking about what is happening will help you validate your reality and reduce your isolation. Number 3, start to document what's happening. Keep a running incident of dates, texts, emails, photos of injuries and damage. Because here's the other nasty side of all of this. Men's stories of abuse are not believed as often as women's stories of abuse. And if a woman changes a story and makes you the abuser when you're the one being abused, you're more likely to go down as the one who's doing the harm. So start to document, keep a running record of what's happening so that if you seek legal protection in custody, you have evidence that you may need later. Number 4, prioritize your safety. If you're in immediate danger, call 911 or emergency line and think about creating a safety plan. Know where you can go and know how to be able to leave quickly and set aside essential things like documents, cash, and keys. Number 5, seek professional help. You might want to contact a domestic violence hotline that now is more likely to recognize and serve male survivors, or consider talking to a therapist who understands abuse dynamics. They can help you counteract the gaslighting and start to rebuild confidence. Number 6, know your rights. Men are entitled to same legal protections, restraining orders, custody considerations, criminal charges against abusive partners. And laws may vary from state to state, but abuse is abuse, regardless of the gender. And don't minimize your pain. Tolerating abuse is not a measurement of strength or of you, or even claiming you're abused is not a measurement of weakness. Men downplaying their suffering because of this is only harming everybody involved. And naming it is the first steps to freedom and towards your healing. All right. I know this was really a big topic today, and I often run out of time. Today, actually, I'm not running out of time. So I have time today for me to take your questions. Maybe you want to talk more about this subject. Maybe there's something else that you'd like to cover. But when you're, so what comes to top of mind? Maybe it could be anything related to mental health issues. So, yeah, I would really love to be able to take this into a little deeper dive. And I'm going to start looking at the comments that have been showing up. I'm actually going to turn them on so that you guys can see them yourselves if you're watching it at some of the other live streams. All right. Oh, I know. There was a question that came in last week that I never addressed, and that was, how do you heal? Because in some of the social media, I had a video that blew up. It got viral on me. And the video was that you're being harmed by cognitive dissonance, that it's actually is shrinking your hippocampus, it's enlarging your amygdala, and it's impairing your executive functioning. And the question that came in that didn't get addressed last week was, how do you heal? If your brain is being harmed, like literally physically being harmed, and by the way, it was showing up. I mean, they can see it on scans that there are changes, like biological changes to our brain. So how do we rewire something that has been harmed after this has happened to us? So I did some research into it to help you with that question, because it is a really important one. And I know that I have been infected. Because here's one of the ways. I used to be one of these people who would read a book a day, way back in the day when I was a kid, and I had nothing better to do and I wanted to stay out of working. I would hide in a room and read. And as long as I was hiding, people, my mom and dad would leave me alone. So I find today reading really hard. It's one of the ways in which the abuse has harmed me. It's made me more distractible. I have a real hard time sort of centering myself, I get real jittery really easily. So yeah, it is harmful, but there is good news. So for those of you who saw last week and would like to know, they have found that it is possible to do some repair. It probably won't go back to the way that it originally was, but you can make some changes. So what really is helpful is get trauma focused psychotherapy. There's strong evidence for that normalizing circuit functions. Consider regular aerobic exercises like brisk walking 3 to 4 times a week because that has been associated with hippocampus growth and better memory. Practice mindfulness and meditation. They suggest an 8-week protocol because they have found that there's structural and functional changes in both how the hippocampus, which has to do with memory consolidation, and the amygdala, which has to do with regulation of fight or flight, that it improves with consistent practice of mindfulness and meditation. Also, consider some form of cognitive training to help you with better planning and attention, because when that's been paired with therapy, there's been evidence that that's very, very helpful. And there's emerging options of like neurofeedback showing early signs of structural benefits, but they need larger trials. So let me kind of say that in more everyday language. If you're looking to help rewire your brain after experiencing chronic abuse, make your primary concern good self-care practices. And it always seems to come back to that, doesn't it? Make sure you're getting enough sleep. Really try to, like, lately what I've been doing, and I found it on Amazon. It's been really, really helpful. I've been wearing, my son has got me into this. I've been wearing a eye mask to block the light. And I suffer from dry eyes, so this eye mask also sort of creates a humid environment so my eyes don't dry out so bad. And I have found that I've been sleeping deeper because think about it. If you're in a fight or flight state, then that means any change in the room, including lighting and sound, is going to be disruptive. So I find that wearing an eye mask at night has really been helpful for me to block out the light, and I sleep deeper. I feel that it's just a much more restorative, sleep, way more restorative. So be mindful of the things that you can do that really are good practices that are helpful. So aerobic exercise is helpful, meditation and mindfulness. Be sensitive to how things around you, the sounds, are you giving yourself quiet? Are you giving yourself sort of peacefulness so that you can re-regulate yourself? All of that can be very, very helpful in this healing process. And of course, therapy always helps. Yeah, someone just said avoid triggers. I agree. If you can, when you can, avoid triggers. Okay, so let's jump back to your questions. I'm going to read the comments coming in. Um, It just ended. It took all my strength, and I feel better immediately after I left. Well, first off, awesome. I'm really glad that you were able to leave. That is a really hard thing to do. So I'm really glad that you're able to do that. And we don't always feel better right after we leave. So the fact that you are feeling relief, to me, that's really amazing. I'm glad that there's been relief for you. I know this was people are over on YouTube and Facebook talking about what they do that's really helpful. They have blackout curtains. I do too, but the light creeps in around them. And you guys know I'm autistic, so that means I'm really sensitive to stimulation of any kind. In fact, I have a fan running all the time in my room, and it's quite loud and noisy. I like white noise because I live with tinnitus, so I have constant ringing in my ears. So it helps offset the tinnitus, but it also blocks off any noise. My mom used to say that when I was a kid, if you walked in the house on one end of the house, I would hear it on the other end of the house. I would know. I'm just really, really sensitive that way. Yeah, somebody also talks about just sea breeze, listening. I love that. That's really, really peaceful. Yeah, I agree. So someone commented about this person who just left, that leaving is huge. It takes so much bravery it does. It takes a lot of bravery to leave. Um, so someone asked, I need severe treatment for narcissistic abuse, but I'm scared that I can't properly communicate for myself to avoid being dismissed or invalidated. This is a common fear. I think a lot of us end up not seeking help because we end up getting afraid that we're not going to be believed. What that says to me is that you haven't found the right person. If they're not listening, then that says to me this is not a safe person who probably doesn't know enough about abusive relationships, that you should try somebody else. So don't see it as a failure of yours or a reflection on you. See it as a limitation of the person that you're speaking to. Okay, I hear that there is a question that came about 10 comments up. Let me see if I can find it. Okay. I have a lot of experience with being feared, and I'm not scary. This is a guy, by the way. People tend to think that I'm being abusive when I'm not. And this is serious. Any insight? That's interesting. I find it really intriguing that you're experienced as intimidating and fearful when you know that inside yourself that's not where you're at or what you're meaning to come across as. You know how we say that some people have a sort of a rusting bitch face? Women get accused of that. So I wonder, have you ever had an opportunity to ask somebody that you trust? Somebody just said smile. I don't think it's that simple. I'm sure he's tried smiling actually. But I would be really curious to have follow up with somebody that you trust a whole lot and ask them what kind of energy that you're giving off. Okay, what do I mean by that? I know a clinician, I worked with her, I supervised her, that she gave off a lot of seductive energy. This woman was not trying to seduce anybody. She was just going about her life. But for whatever reason, she happened to have that vibe that gave you that feel so that people around her tended to feel like it was something that it wasn't. And she would actually come into work with her hair pulled up in a strict kind of straight haircut style and no makeup, trying to make yourself look as unattractive as possible. So sometimes it's more of our charisma that ends up kind of playing across that people pick up. So I'd kind of be curious to see what others that you trust give you real feedback in an honest way could kind of maybe clue you in about that. And then maybe based on that, I mean, I'm hard pressed to really know exactly what to tell you about how to change that. But my thought is if you can get really good feedback, that's a great way to start because then you can start to look into it to see what you can do. Because her and I had big conversations about it. I was concerned about its impact on her treatment. She was a clinician. You don't want as a clinician to have every person that walks in your room thinking that somehow there's something more than there is. It's not. You want them to feel safe. So yeah, this is a real serious concern, and I appreciate you asking this. But I would start there first to get some more insight. I'm smart, I'm handsome, and I'm fit, and people trust me don't feel this way. It's exes. Oh, and you're gay. Okay, interesting. Huh. Okay. So I'm really thinking about what you're saying. Your past partners feel you're intimidating, but people who know you don't feel that way and they trust you. So here's another way angle to look at it. You might want to consider, is it that you're picking a certain kind of partner who likes to always switch the narrative and make you out to be the perpetrator and them the victim? Could it be, because that's a form of DARVO, by the way, could it be the reason why it's happening that way? Because you happen to unfortunately meet a certain type of person who tends to need to be the victim in the story. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there as a possible way to consider because you're coming in and saying I'm clear and I'm assertive. Yes, but that doesn't mean people don't change narratives on us. And part of what's abuse is the rewriting of a narrative. Like my ex who comes into the relationship and basically is taking advantage of me every which way in any angle and claims at the end that somehow I took advantage of him. That's a good example of that. Um, Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I'm sorry. I just highlighted something. I touched the mouse. So Kyle, please forgive me or Kylie, forgive me for that. I did not I don't like how do I do that? I don't know how to undo that. Anyway, so all right, guys. Yeah, you missing those on TikTok are missing what's happening. I've got this new I'm using Restream, and as a result, it has a way of like highlighting the questions. And I didn't even know I could do that. Yeah, it's interesting. Some people are still talking to Gabriel about how yeah, and I do agree, Kylie, with your question though. Abusers are not naive. The abusers are perfecting their manipulation and cruelty to dominate. Absolutely, they absolutely have ears. Yeah, and I also agree with the comment that came in that um, doesn't also assertiveness may mean different things to different people. In that could be yeah, exactly. It means that you don't speak indirectly or passively. Well, that's your interpretation. Doesn't mean that's everybody's interpretation. Um, yeah, I hate the fact this is so sensitive because now it's trying to like block and I can't take this one comment off. I want to take the comment off. How do I take that comment off? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about that. Okay, show on live stream. And now how do I hide? I don't want to hide the message. Can I go backwards? Sorry, guys. Okay. Oh, okay. I figured out how to take that off. Sorry for that. I'm still trying to figure out how to use this new thing. Okay, other questions for me. I've got 10 minutes here. How do you not react when they're using DARVO all the way through? And I'm going to actually know how to actually show this now that I know how to do this. It's so cool. Oops, we're back to the same question, and I didn't mean to do that. I don't want to use that question. I want to talk about the this is a question. It's moving on me, which is why I'm struggling. Okay. How do you not react when they're using there we go. How do you not react when they're using DARVO all the way through and it winds you up to such an extreme that you end up extremely angry and coming undone? Okay, that's a great question. And boy, am I right with you. It really winds me up too when it happens. The best way that you can do it is realizing that this just because someone says it's true doesn't make it true. And I know that's easier said than done because you want to be understood. Everybody wants to be understood. And they know that, which is why they're upsetting you by saying that. You have to have some measure of ob of observing the dynamic that's going on so that you can step back and talk yourself away and out of it, saying, "I know this is unfair. I know this is true." But then remind yourself that no matter what you say isn't going to change the narrative. You're not gonna convince them of something they don't wanna be convinced of. You're just spending a lot of time trying to waste effort to change the narrative so that you feel better. The challenge is the way for you to not get so wound up is for you to soothe yourself, for you to say, I know the truth. That isn't the truth. And I'm not going to convince them of it by trying to argue this or defend or explain. Remember, Jade, don't justify, explain, defend, or don't justify, attack, let me say it again. Don't justify, don't attack, don't defend, and don't explain. So if you're finding the pull to do one of those things, remind yourself that you can do this for yourself. You can tell yourself the truth and that should be enough. What you're revealing in that is that you're very invested in that other person's opinion and you're giving them a lot of power in the relationship, which is making you extremely vulnerable. And the way out of it is for you to remove your investment from the relationship. And that no, that's not easy to do. It takes you actually saying to yourself, I actually had to say to myself, Carrie, stop caring about his opinion. Carrie, you don't need his advice. Carrie, you don't need his approval. I'd actually say this in my head as a way for me to combat the pull to go to this person to somehow get there to sort of like their take on something. Um, all right. I appreciate Leslie, you're trying to help me. I thought the whole point of being healthy is being honest, confident, direct, and compassionate and warm. The partners I pick use DARVO a lot. See, that's a really good point that you're bringing up there. And I hope you'll join me next week because we're going to really do a deep dive on it next week. We're going to look at how people can misunderstand our motives and attribute betrayal to us when we're not trying to be hurtful or harmful. But there are multiple ways in which we see the world. I was talking to ChatGPT doing some research for this upcoming live next week on worldviews, and I said, "Yeah, there's a collaborative and competitive mindset." And it goes, "Well, yeah, that's one of six, two of six. There's four others." Like what? What are the other four? So we had this big, massive discussion about what really is healthiness and what are people's goals and what do they pursue? What do they look for with integrity? So yeah, for you, Gabriel, healthiness is being honest, confident, direct, and compassionate and warm. But other partners may be being individualistic or thinking of the collective good or everybody out for themselves. So there are other ways in which people go into the world kind of with their own motives and their own agendas. So we often may think we're doing all the right things and doing it in a very compassionate way. And for someone else, they could see that as not. They could actually see it as foolishness. Um, yeah, I like his awareness too. I agree. Yeah, don't justify, attack, defend. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, DARVO is what, DARVO was identified by Jennifer Freed, and she talks about it a bit in her book, Blind by Betrayal. But yeah, she's the one that coined the term. It's really fascinating stuff. Other questions for me. Yeah, narc free. It's hard to be narc free is the way to go. I agree, but it's hard to be narc free. Maybe let me say that in more kind of general, realistic terms. It's hard to be healthy. It's hard to find healthy relationships. And the people that I've been talking to who really are in this a realm, they say is they work on themselves and heal, that they have fewer and fewer relationships. Isn't that sad? That it often takes us, we have to vet people for a long time. We have to let trust grow over a long period. We have to watch what happens in conflict. We have to make sure this person's equally interested in repair over that they value the relationship as much as we value the relationship and that they're putting as much of their own self into it as we are. It takes a lot of time for that to happen. Yeah, the Blinded by Betrayal is a fantastic book. If those of you looking for a really good book on what happens, why we don't see the betrayal when we're in it, it is a really amazing book. But yeah, I agree. I would like us to be narc free as well, but I think that the only way to do it is to be careful and take our time. And here's the thing that I've noticed for people after being in a toxic relationship is we end up thinking that being cautious and taking time is a form of paranoia. We often say, "I miss the old self when I just trusted everybody and I thought that everybody was basically good." Well, that wasn't ever good. And paranoia actually is distrusting everybody. So neither extreme is good. Trusting everybody or mistrusting everybody is both sides of the same coin. Neither are healthy. Healthiness takes time, knows that things are you have to learn people over time, watch how things go, really listen to yourself. I've been realizing that I often get early signals that something's not right, but I'm so invested in wanting to be in a relationship and wanting it to work out that I override that. So learn to recognize what your biases are so that you can protect yourself from your own good nature. Other questions for me today? Yeah, we're gonna be talking about worldviews next week. So I hope you join. That would be great because we're gonna get into all six of them. And I also think on the worldviews that we have, that we may have one that we do default to when we're feeling kind of generous and in a good space and safe. But I also think we have a shadow side. So when we start to feel shaky or insecure, there's one that we're gonna default to. The glamorization incentives for those narcissistic behavior patterns unfortunately perpetuates and promotes it. That's interesting. Can you say more, Bear, or what you mean by that? I'm kind of intrigued by what you think. Ooh, somebody who said they got diagnosed with a paranoid personality disorder because of their abuser. Have you guys heard of gaslight syndrome? It's a real thing. And and it probably happens more often than we think. It's when the abuser sets up a narrative as a person. Well, think of Betty Broderick, for example. Now, I'm not saying she wasn't sort of come off really hysterical, maybe not even likable. I mean, when I watched, I'm not for sure I would have liked her, but I think she got set up. And I think that her ex did a really good job at making her look crazy. And so she ended up acting crazy, which kind of confirmed it because she was trying to like disconfirm the craziness. And she ended up looking more and more crazy as a result of that. So be really it it does happen where we end up thinking that the person who's reacting is the sick one and we don't realize that it's been confabulated to make them look sick. It actually happened. It happened around the Nixon era with Watergate. One of the guys involved, I don't remember who it was, but his wife ended up getting institutionalized because she knew what was really going on. And to shut her up, they made her look crazy. Yeah, narcissists called non-narcissist narcissists, and that makes me I agree, I do agree, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, they know that they're abusing us because they won't do it in front of other people. They abuse indoors, exactly. Oh, somebody is asking, what does DARVO mean? Okay, so I'm gonna use this as my last question and then wrap it up. And somebody also asked if I take individual clients. No, actually, I'm gonna be doing some changing, and, one of the things the changes I'm making is that I'm not gonna be doing any direct client work going forward in the future. I'm getting old these days, and it's just I really want to focus more on lives and education, and helping people in more of a larger context. This is a great way to do it. So that's why I really enjoy the podcast. So yeah, I'm not taking individual clients. But DARVO, what is DARVO? DARVO is to deny. So say really wait. I don't like the acronym because to me it's kind of confusing. A great way to say it is say you bring up an issue Like, did you take out the trash? So a person using DARVO on you would say, you never told me that." They would deny it. Or they would say, "I never knew that I was supposed to do that." So some form of denial. Then the next thing they do is they would then flip it and attack you. "I can't believe you're on me about this. You know what a kind of a day I had. Can you stop nagging? Or why do you always have to bring this up?" Or we're just about ready to sit down and have dinner, and now you're going to have to ruin it with this conversation. So there's some form of an attack. And then that very process of denying and attacking you makes them victimized by your issue. Now they've become the victim, and you're the bad guy for bringing the issue up. So there's where the reverse victim and offender. So what it stands for is deny, DA, attack, A, and then RVO, reverse the position of the victor and make the victim become the offender. So the very fact that you have an issue, you are thanks, Vera. The very fact that you have an issue, you're now the bad guy for having the issue. You're the bad guy. You're the perpetrator, the offender. Yeah, one of my followers, I know you're one of my subscribers actually, that I'm elevating. I'm not aging. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate that. You guys are always so much fun to hang out with. And in July, when Dr. Carter retired, I know you guys, a lot of you are team healthy, and you've been, you suggested maybe that we should find a name for ourselves. So I'm gonna roll with that idea. I was at first sort of like, I don't know. I always feel so uncomfortable, and I just respect the man so much that I don't ever want to be in any way, you know, seen as, I don't know, just like I'm not respecting him. But I decided, because some of you suggested it, we're gonna call ourselves Team Care, because my nickname has been in some circles Care for Carrie. So I'm going to start talking more about all of you who are in my community, who follow me, who come up and show up every week on these lives at 4 p.m. as part of my community. You're going to see a lot more coming out from me on this to really facilitate a community feel. But we're Team Care. So thank you so much for being a part of it and for joining me today with this. Um, Oh, if somebody's confronting me for the podcast yesterday, why would I platform the person I platformed yesterday? Well, I'll tell you, I do appreciate you asking me. Why did I move forward with that interview when you could tell I disagreed with what was happening? Because although I was polite about it and gracious, but I did disagree. And I even put a disclaimer on both the audio and the video version of it. I understood that he was trying to use my platform. Sure. I'm not dumb to that. I know that that happens. And people have platformed me, and I've always appreciated the leg up when it happens. Dr. Carter has been one of the people who have platformed me many times, and I deeply, deeply appreciated his help with that. But here's the thing, if we can't talk about opposing perspectives and understanding there's differences in how we interpret things, we can never come to any form of agreement. Am I going to change Josh's mind on what abuse is? Probably not. But look what's come out of this. We got to talk about it today here. I got to talk about the fact that men do get abused, and not just the way in which Josh defines abuse, which is not getting the life that he wants, that there is real men being really abused, and that we should see that as a serious issue. And there needs to be time and effort devoted to that. So as much as we may not agree with Josh's perspective, and it may have been very triggering to hear that podcast episode yesterday, it opened a discussion that's important, that's helpful to everybody, because now it's in the open. So that's why I allowed that. And I did debate, do I post that, or do I just bank it somewhere? I considered banking it and not ever posting it. But I felt that, yeah, I knew it was going to be upsetting. I knew what you guys' opinions were going to be, but I decided it was better to have an open discussion. Exactly. I don't have to be right. They don't have to be right, and I don't have to be wrong, but we can at least talk about it. And that's what we did. So yeah, you guys you're all bouncing Team Care. I'm thinking of spelling it like Care. So yeah, because my last name is Kerr. My maiden name is Kerr, Kerr. Or yeah, I don't know. I'm open to Ker too, because I know some people have said that. Yeah, we can agree to disagree. I agree, Divine Fire. We can agree to disagree. And I want to hear all sorts of opinions. So I'm not going to always have people who come on my platform who align with me. Sometimes I want to take on people who don't align with me. So in fact, I know I have several interviews coming up on parental estrangement. Some people got very mad at me. I actually had persons say, I'm not following you anymore because I dared to platform the doormat mom. Now, do I agree with her definition of of parental estrangement and her entitled viewpoint of what children owe adults, their parents? No, I do not agree with her. But I don't think that everything she says is wrong. And I do think there are children who are abusing their parents, and there are also parents who are abusing their adult children. So I want this to be a safe place for us to talk about very tough, tricky issues in a cordial way. So thank you for that. Thank you for giving me the respect and the tolerance and the patience to allow those types of discussions to occur. All right. Next week, like I said, we're going to be talking about actually worldviews, perspectives, and how that can lead to misunderstandings around betrayal. So I'd love you to come back next week at Tuesday, 4 p.m. Central Standard Time, and we'll get into the competitive versus the competitive, or the collaborative, the collectivistic, individualistic, and there's one more that I can't think of, but we'll get into all of that next week. And we'll even give you a test to figure out which worldviews you guys align with. All right. I really am thrilled to hang out with you today, and I will see you back here next week.